Tell me, do you fear death? If you do, have you ever wondered what would be the worst way to go? Nowadays, if asking an average person, the answer would probably be something like drowning or dying in a house fire. But history is a graveyard of shitty exits, and today, we're going to rank some of the worst. Back when people were not on top of the food chain, life was simpler. Eat, sleep, reproduce, repeat. But it was also infinitely more deadly to the average man or woman as we shared space with hungry predators. Imagine this. After a long day of smashing rocks, you go to the nearby pond to get something to drink. You kneel over the edge to get your first sip and see a crocodile. Congratulations. You did just unga your last bunga. We have archaeological evidence showing carnivore punctures and other marks on human remains from caves and open sites in Africa and Europe. Being munched on by a crocodile or a leopard while still breathing definitely wasn't nice, but it isn't likely to last long. Now, to determine which type of death is the worst, we are going to rank them on a score of 1 to 5 on a few criteria: pain, length, public shame, fear factor, and likelihood. So, since being eaten by a wild animal was not a common occurrence, even in the prehistory, and the concept of public shame was not a thing, it gets a 4 for pain, 2 for length, 1 for the shame, 5 for the fear factor, and a 2 for the likelihood of it happening. This gives us a crisp total of 14 points for being eaten alive. Now, while a close encounter with a beast sucked, the quiet killer was ordinary injury. A simple scratch could be your undoing. One day you are fine and well, and the next, you are dead. Osteological records indicate various infections, including osteomyelitis, which is a terrible experience on its own. These are believed to have been fairly common among our ancestors. And without access to antibiotics, a simple scratch could easily escalate to fever and sepsis over days. The worst part is that when it gets bad enough, you are likely left behind by your kin as you slowly become dead weight. Yikes. Depending on the severity of the infection, the pain can vary, so let's give it a 3 on our scale. For length, a 3 as well, as it would take days for you to go offline. Public shame gets a 1, since likely none would be there to see you go. Fear also gets a 1, as you'd be too dumb to understand what is happening. And lastly, the likelihood gets a 5, as it would be dead easy to wound yourself, which gives us a total of 13 for dying of infection. Now, last but not least, for the prehistory would definitely be the rarest out of the bunch. Scarcity pushed groups across lines they would not otherwise cross, and one such line would be to take a bite out of your neighbor. While not believed to be common, sites like Atapuerca in Spain, Maszczycka Cave in Poland, and most notably Gouf's Cave in England, preserve cut marks that match butchery patterns used on animals, and marks of human teeth on butchered bone, which heavily implies that a degree of cannibalism took place across prehistoric Europe. Whether ritualistic or committed out of necessity, the idea of being sacrificed and eaten by a fellow human is certainly disturbing. How likely was it? Hard to tell, unfortunately, but judging by the fact that we found skulls fashioned into drinking cups, it would be safe to assume that our ancestors were not messing around. With this, ritual killing and cannibalism gets a tasty 3 for pain, a 2 for length, as the butchering would likely happen after you kick the bucket, a 5 for shame, because if you get picked, you are likely the weakest link. Then, a 1 for fear and likelihood, as these rituals wouldn't be too common, which leaves us with a total of 12. Now that we are done with prehistory, let's jog your memory and summarize the totally not arbitrary scores. Cannibalism is in the 3rd place with 12 points, dying of infection is 2nd with 13 points, and in the 1st place, getting eaten by a wild animal with 14 points. Keep those scores in mind, and let us move on to... If natural environment was the leading cause of death in the prehistory, in antiquity, we were our own worst enemy. If you think human ancestors had it rough, get ready to hear about the devilishly messed up ways you could get your shit rocked in the ancient times. Tell me, ever heard of crucifixion? You know, that thing that happened to Jesus. Yeah, not fun at all. If you just so happen to be a rowdy slave or a rebel, you could get nailed, and not in a good sense. The way it was done was simple. A cross, or more commonly an X, was built out of wood. The victim was placed on it with their limbs spread, then nailed or tied down. The frame was lifted upright, and they were left to die. In most cases, the victim had already been beaten and was half on their way to the other side, so how much time they spent on the cross varied. Sometimes it was hours, sometimes days. Crucifixions were most popular in the late Roman Republic, but the practice survived into the early empire until Emperor Constantine finally banned it in the 4th century. Roman citizens were usually off limits. Everyone else, slaves, rebels, pirates, deserters, bandits, thieves, traitors, could end up on display. So, crucifixion. Painful, slow, humiliating, and biblically significant. A tragic way to go, but let's not dwell on it too long. Here are the scores, and let us keep a move on. By the way, if you disagree with my picks, scores, or think that I missed something, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video so far, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Back to the video. Now we shift east to the imperial lands of Assyria, where a wrong move could get you turned into a human kebab. While not confined to Assyria alone, impalement certainly played a part in keeping the people inhabiting it in check. The formula was simple. A city is rebelling, subdue it and impale a portion of the population. You captured some enemy soldiers after a victory and don't know what to do with them? A stake up the ass it is. Barbaric, but very effective in mental warfare. If you don't get how brutal impalement was, let me paint a picture for you. There really were two main methods of doing it. One, where the stake goes through the chest-piercing vital organs. This was the quick and tame version, if you can call it that. The second one was a favorite of Assyrian kings, such as Ashurnasirpal II. The stake pierces through the soft tissues between the legs and goes just far enough to support the weight of the body. This method was designed to not pierce vital organs, so the agony could be felt for hours or even days, with victims usually bleeding out or dying of associated causes, such as infections, dehydration, or exhaustion and breathing failure. You would truly be hard-pressed for a more horrifying death in the Antiquity, so here are the scores for impalement, and let us again move to Rome, which has another trick up its sleeve. The penalty of the sack was a Roman method of execution that was so creative that it almost sounds fake. It was reserved for those that committed murder or other severely heinous crime against one's family. The Roman Republic version of the punishment entailed sewing the offender into a sack and tossing them into a body of water. In later years, Romans got creative, and supposedly, animals such as snakes, roosters, dogs, or even apes were sewn into the sack alongside the offender, as written by a 3rd century jurist, Herennius Modestinus, quote, "The penalty of parricide, killing of parents, as prescribed by our ancestors, is that the culprit shall be beaten with rods stained with his blood, and then shall be sewed up in a sack with a dog, a cock, a viper, and an ape, and the bag cast into the depth of the sea, that is to say, if the sea is near at hand. Otherwise it shall be thrown to wild beasts, according to the constitution of the divine Hadrian." Now, I will just let you imagine how horrific that was. You are bloodied, sewn into a tight sack, thrashing around with a mini zoo of furious animals, and then dumped into the water to drown with them. As cruel as it was easy to avoid. Just don't kill your parents, unless you did, in which case, good luck. And with that, let's add up the points and bring out the podium. In our Antiquity bracket, the sack penalty limps into 3rd place, with 14 points overall. Crucifixion is 2nd, with 16 points in total. And sitting alone with 21 points is impalement, a brutal, painful, and truly horrifying front-runner for the worst way to die so far. Now tighten your butt cheeks, and let us move on to... The Middle Ages were full of awful ways to die, but there was one that stood out among the rest, as something that not only killed a 1/3 of European population, but became synonymous with the time period. Enter the bubonic plague. Transferred from fleas to rats to humans, and then from infected humans to other humans. The Black Death, as it was called, was a certain death sentence once contracted. The illness manifested with a simple headache and chills, only to quickly escalate to fever, delirium, respiratory issues, and worst of all, painful pus-filled sores called buboes. The fact that buboes formed in numbers around the armpits and the groin didn't make the suffering any easier, and most people died within the span of a few days after showing symptoms. The Black Death for years was the boogeyman of Europe, killing millions of people and terrifying entire populations. So, as an exception alongside its 5 out of 5 score for the fear factor and the likelihood of occurrence, it will get a bonus point to both, giving us a total of 21. Now, getting back to good old human-administered deaths, let me introduce you to a wooden pyre and a flaming torch. Popular among punishments administered to heretics, burning at a stake was an excruciatingly painful method of execution that took the lives of some very famous people, such as Joan of Arc, Jan Hus, or Jacques de Molay. The principle was simple. A wooden pyre with a stake in the center is constructed in a public place, soaked with flammable liquids and stuffed with straw for easy ignition. The victim was then chained to the stake, and when the time was right, the whole thing was put ablaze. These types of executions were often big events. Many people viewed them as a distraction from their otherwise boring lives. And with many people gathering for the spectacle, clever merchants used them to peddle their wares. Just imagine the shame when you are about to suffer a painful death, while people shout obscenities at you only to see a local baker selling meat pies to be enjoyed while you turn to dust. The whole ordeal deserves a definite 5 out of 5 for the pain and shame. It would be hard to judge likelihood, as burnings did happen in the Middle Ages and beyond, but weren't really that common, so a steady 2 for likelihood feels right. Now, picture every dark, barbaric, filthy, and twisted stereotype you've ever heard about the Middle Ages. Got it? Now imagine the worst possible execution you think that brutal world could invent. Odds are, whatever you're picturing still doesn't come close to what actually happened to William Wallace and countless others. Reserved for those guilty of high treason, the punishment known as being hanged, drawn, and quartered was among the most horrific deaths ever carried out on the British Isles. It began with humiliation. The condemned was tied by the ankles to a wooden pole, harnessed behind a horse, and dragged for miles to the place of execution. Crowds lined the route, hurling insults, garbage, and waste. The horse's pace was kept slow enough to prolong the agony at least, but not enough to kill. Next came the hanging. A noose was tightened around the neck of the victim, who then was slowly hoisted up and suspended from a ladder or the gallows to slowly strangle up until the brink of death. For many, that was mercifully the end. But for the truly unfortunate, like Wallace, it was only the beginning. Cut down from the rope, still alive, they were disemboweled, forced to watch as their own entrails were pulled out and burned before their eyes. Often, they were also emasculated in the process. If, by some cruel miracle, they were still breathing, the next act, beheading, would finally end their suffering. After getting their head lobbed off comes the quartering, which is exactly what you think it is. The limbs get chopped off, and whatever is left of the torso is cut into pieces. The remains are then put on display in prominent places, serving as a not-so-subtle reminder that if you fuck around in the Kingdom of England, you might just find out. Not much else is left to say, really. A perfect score for almost all criteria makes hanging, drawing, and quartering a top contender for the worst way to die throughout history. At least for now. With all 3 out of the way, let's see how the classification looks like for the medieval period, shall we? At the bottom, surprisingly, we have being burned at the stake with 17 points. Next, we have the bubonic plague scoring a strong 21. Then, our top dog, the hanging, burning, and quartering, takes the first place with 23. Please don't ask me how we got here or how the scoring works. It's just vibes. Now, onward to the next era, which is... With industrialization came a genuine shift in everyday life for many Westerners. Clean water and sewers cut disease, railways moved food and people faster than ever, refrigeration kept it fresh, public schools increased literacy rates, and basic medicine stopped routine injuries from being a death sentence. It finally felt like progress meant safety. Then you strike a match. In the early 19th century, friction matches took off, and factories bloomed across Europe and the United States. Early friction matches used antimony sulfide, gum, and potash chlorate for their heads, producing an unstable concoction, prone to accidental and volatile ignition. A French chemist named Charles Soria proposed an improvement by replacing antimony sulfide with white phosphorus. It made matches more stable, reliable, and commercially attractive. It also created the conditions for a new industrial disease, phosphorus-induced necrosis of the jaw, soon known as phossy jaw. In poorly ventilated match factories, workers, most of them low-paid women and girls, breathed white phosphorus fumes every shift. The first symptoms of phossy jaw were toothache, gum irritation, swelling, and tenderness. Over time, infections took hold. Teeth loosened and fell out. Abscesses formed in and around the jawbone, and the pain became severe. Within a few months, dead bone began to separate from living bone. Then, within roughly 6 months, large parts of the mandible became necrotic. At that stage, the only effective treatment was surgical removal of the affected jawbone to prevent the disease spreading towards the skull and brain. Those who survived were left with heavy facial disfigurement, difficulty speaking, and long-term problems chewing and maintaining nutrition. What makes this especially grim is that, as the association between white phosphorus and phossy jaw became increasingly clear, reform was slow. Safer alternatives existed, but regulation and change lagged for decades, largely because this was seen as a disease of poor, replaceable workers, rather than a cost of progress that demanded an immediate solution. The fact that the alternatives were more expensive didn't help the workers' case either. In the end, phossy jaw was linked to thousands of deaths among match factory workers. It was agonizing and rapidly progressing, and the only effective treatments were invasive, often leaving lasting disfigurement and partial disability. Caught between fear of the disease and the need to keep earning, many workers stayed at their benches long after the first symptoms began, leading to their deaths. Staying on the theme of shitty things happening to manual workers, let's talk about industrial feats of engineering, big-ass bridges. Have you ever wondered how the underwater foundations for constructions, such as the Brooklyn Bridge, were built without modern machinery and construction methods? Well, they owe their existence largely to laborers colloquially known as sand hogs, working in pressurized underwater chambers called caissons. But what exactly is a caisson, you ask? Think of it like an enormous, open-bottomed, upside-down cup or box, with a thick top and the sides tapering down into sharp blades. It's lowered into the river or seabed, and air is pumped into the chamber to keep the water out, allowing workers to stand on the bottom and dig out the mud and rock. This required the air pressure inside the caisson to be far higher than the normal atmospheric pressure we breathe. The pressure was necessary to keep the water from rushing in, but it was also deadly. In these conditions, large amounts of inert gases, primarily nitrogen from the air they breathed, would dissolve harmlessly into their blood and tissues, just like carbon dioxide is forced into solution when a bottle of soda is capped. The problem wasn't in the work itself, but in the exit. When these workers ascended too quickly through the airlocks, the sudden drop in pressure was identical to uncapping that soda bottle. The dissolved and pressurized nitrogen gas in their blood and tissue would rapidly bubble out and expand inside their bodies. These expanded microbubbles of nitrogen would lodge in joints, nerves, and the spinal cord. The pain was so immediate and overwhelming that victims would literally bend and writhe, clutching their limbs in agony, hence the colloquial name of the condition, the bends. The thing is, at the time the decompression sickness was rampant, the concept of such deep-water labor was still very new, so the link between the depressurization and the sickness was not immediately obvious. The bends could also lead to paralysis, blindness, and sudden crushing pain in the chest known as the chokes, which often preceded death from lung damage or a stroke. It was a terrifying unseen tax levied on the working class for the sake of industrial expansion, a technological terror that claimed hundreds of lives and permanently crippled thousands more. The industrial age eventually led to the Great War, an unprecedented slaughter where technological progress was twisted into mass murdering efficiency. And nothing exemplifies this more than chemical warfare, specifically mustard gas. First deployed by the German army in Belgium in the summer of 1917, mustard gas was nicknamed as such, because in its impure battlefield form, it was typically a yellow to brown oily liquid that gave off a distinct, pungent odor, reminiscent of mustard, garlic, or horseradish due to impurities. The gas was a potent, blistering, carcinogenic, and mutagenic agent that upon contact with tissue wreaked havoc on the victim's body. Its true strength laid in its delayed effect. The latency period for mustard gas symptoms often lasted for hours. A soldier could be exposed, think he was fine, and then hours later begin his irreversible descent into agony. The immediate effect upon contact with the vapor was eye and throat irritation. The victims were blinded, their eyes swelling shut. Then blisters would erupt, stripping the skin away. But the true horror was the inside. The gas would destroy and chemically burn the lining of the respiratory system. This caused the tissue to die, and in extreme cases slough off, forming airway-occlusive pseudomembranes that physically obstructed the bronchial passages. The affected struggled for air for days due to asphyxiation for prolonged periods of time, which lingered over the victims, like a curse for years after exposure. Mustard gas was initially delivered in artillery shells, which allowed it to be deployed across the entire battlefield. Critically, its low volatility meant the liquid agent persisted on the ground for days or weeks, creating a long-term contamination hazard and making it impossible to hide from. Though it had a relatively low fatality rate, estimated as low as 2.5 to 3.6 per 100 chemical warfare-related casualties, it was crippling, with tens of thousands of soldiers suffering permanent disability by chronic respiratory diseases. The rise of chemical warfare was unfortunately just a prelude to the horrors that people would inflict onto each other in the coming decades. Although not as deadly as you'd might expect, the sheer amount of soldiers severely injured due to exposure puts mustard gas up there as one of the worst things that can happen to a man. That being said, it is nothing compared to the little and innocent thing called an atomic bomb. Wait, what the hell is that?